Thank you for joining. My name is Dustin Sachs, S-A-C-H-S. I am the head of governance, risk, and compliance for World Fuel Services, which is a fuel services company based out of Miami. In my free time, my abundance of free time, I'm also a doctoral student studying cybersecurity and information assurance. And today I wanted to talk about, I'm going to talk about a topic that's really become very interesting to me, something that has certainly I've noticed is kind of a not really heavily discussed issue in information security, but one that kind of permeates everything we do, and that's the role that cognitive bias plays in our decision making. Some of the research that I've done and some of the findings that I've found in my own research is very interesting on this topic. So today what we're going to talk about the different types of biases that exist in information security. We'll also talk a little bit about how those biases affect the decision making that we do in cybersecurity. And we're going to talk a little bit, if we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll talk about some of the ways that we can use some of the techniques that are out there to counter some of these biases that exist. So all of this, the purpose behind all of this and the goal of all of this is based on a concept in physics known as the observer effect. Basically, the observer effect is a concept that says that the act of observing something, the act of looking at something, causes it to change. So by looking at and talking about cognitive bias, our hope is that we can now be aware of it, and therefore we can now change our behaviors or alter our behaviors in a way to account for these things. And it's important to mention up front, bias is not in and of itself a negative thing. Bias gets a negative connotation in some situations, but bias has a very important role in decision making because it helps us to make decisions quicker than we could if we truly applied a full decision making process. The challenge that we face is that the human brain is not equipped to handle the level of decision making and the level of thought that has to go into decision making to allow us to make decisions in a timely manner. We would literally come to a stop. We would come to a standstill if we applied a full, proper decision making process. But all of this is based on a concept known as decision theory, and decision theory goes back to primarily to the mid 1950s, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's at the basis of it. Decision theory is based on math. It's based on probabilities. It's based on weighing the value, the numeric value that you can apply to decisions. There are a couple of different types of decision theory or subsets of decision theory. One is known as normative decision theory. The other one is known as prescriptive decision theory. And the last one is known as descriptive decision theory. And it's descriptive decision theory that we're talking about today because descriptive decision theory analyzes how individuals actually make the decisions that they make. The normative and prescriptive decision theories are really very heavily focused on purely theoretical and optimal situations and elements of decision that are more aspirational. There's an important concept that we have to keep in mind that we have to keep in mind as we're having this discussion, though, which is a concept that I've alluded to a little bit, but it's what's known as bounded rationality. And bounded rationality is the idea that our human brain power is limited. We can't think at the levels that are necessary oftentimes to process large sets of data, which is why we use computers and big data analytics and things like that, because we've realized that technology and computers can do it better. There was an article, or there was research that was done that was released that we're now about 12 years past the point where a computer has more computing power than the human brain. But the other thing to keep in mind, and another concept of bounded rationality, is the idea that we as humans make decisions to a specific level. And that level we'll talk about is we make a decision up to the point where we've satisfied the base criteria for that decision, and then we don't go any farther. So we look for the minimum viable, minimum acceptable decision. We go, yeah, you know what? Okay, I'm happy enough with the decision I've made. I'll move on, as opposed to perhaps making the most optimal decision. And that, as you can probably imagine, has some real challenges when you're talking about making decisions on risk and looking at data and trying to decide whether or not the decision that we're making is going to protect our companies. Good enough may not be that, satisfied, made the base most minimum acceptable decision may not be the standard we want to work towards. So there's another concept, and this again goes back to the 17th century, and it's a concept known as choice under uncertainty, and it's the heart of decision theory. And really, what it means, what it looks at is, when people make decisions, and especially when they make decisions where there's lots of uncertainty, what they're looking at is which of the ones can I get the best value, the most certainty out of, and the best value. And here's the example that is typically used to explain this. If I asked everybody in the room right now, and I'm not going to call on you, relax, but if I asked you right now, and I gave you this option, what would your decision be? I will guarantee you $100,000. You have 100% chance of walking out of this room with $100,000. If, however, you wait till the end of the day, you have a 50-50 shot of winning of getting $1 million. Which one are you going to choose? Most people are going to go with the $100,000 that they're going to walk out of the room with, as opposed to what is the higher value decision, the more optimal decision, which is you could have $1 million. But because there's that level of uncertainty in the decision, our minds and our psychology is to say, I'll take less money because there's a higher certainty. The other aspect of choice under uncertainty is another idea known as the prospect theory. And the prospect theory was actually developed, or at least identified, in 1979 by two gentlemen by the name of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And Daniel Kahneman is probably one of the preeminent people when it comes to decision theory and decision under uncertainty and the prospect theory. He actually won a Nobel Prize for it. But the prospect theory is this. It's the concept that we as humans make decisions that tend to focus more on and that tend to apply better and more positive emotion to decisions that will give us higher gain than decisions that could potentially be more optimal but have higher risk. We tend to like more certainty. We tend to be less risky when there is a certainty of gains, and we tend to be more risk averse. We tend to be less likely to take risk when the likelihood of gains is included, and we actually tend to take more risk when there's a chance for losses. It's a very interesting kind of conundrum, But the fact is that if the outcome is going to be positive, we actually want more certainty than if the outcome is likely to be losses where we don't want to be risky. And the example I'll give you is this. Which scenario, so we'll talk about two different scenarios here. And one of them is, they're both this, it's the same scenario, but it's framed actually slightly differently. And the emotion that you're going to kind of feel behind these two is very different, even though they're the exact same. At the end of the day, you are going to end up with $80 in your pocket. But here's how it's going to work. The first time is you are going to have to spend $20 to get $100. So you're going to make out with $80 in the end, but you have to spend $20 to do it. Or I'm going to give you $100 and I'm going to take $20 away from that. And when you think about that at first, and if you magnify that, what you'll find is that people tend to prefer the gain, spending the $20 to make $80, than they are to get $100 but then have money taken away from them, have a loss. So how does this all play in? Well, understanding that the fact that we make decisions, when we're making decisions under uncertainty, under uncertain circumstances, which is basically what we do every day in information security, is make decisions when we're not certain what the outcome is going to be. Understanding kind of the initial mindset helps to frame why we allow, or why we're more open perhaps to allowing bias into our decision making. And again, bias in and of itself gets a negative connotation, but it isn't on its own a negative thing. It does have value. There are over 180 cognitive biases out there. There's a really good resource out there if you're interested. It's called the Cognitive Bias Codex. It's available on through Wikimedia, which is an offshoot of Wikipedia, but it's a really interesting graphic that shows the human brain and shows the 180 biases and how they play out. But there are several biases that are really interesting to talk about, because as we talk about them, you'll see, I think very clearly, how they play in information security and in the work that all of us do. So the first one is, it's a bias, but we're going to hold off on talking about it because it plays more into an aspect of bias, or a subset of bias, which is known as heuristics, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But one of the biases that we have is we actually have a bias against ambiguity. We as humans tend to avoid options where a favorable outcome is more unknown. We tend to move more towards the mindset or decisions that allow for more certainty. Again, back to you could have $100,000 now, or you could have $1 million later today, or a 50-50 shot at $1 million later today. Our mind immediately, in many cases, goes straight to, I want the more certain option. Again, not a bad thing. Certainly having certainty is important, but being aware that your mind is doing that is what's important. Another one that's actually a bias that we don't even think about oftentimes is anecdotal evidence. How many of you have gone to a restaurant that you would never have gone to otherwise, but somebody recommended it to you? How many of you made a decision because because you saw a review somewhere online of somebody else's experience, and you made your decision based solely on the fact that they had a good experience. Does that mean that you are going to have a great experience there? Not necessarily. But we attribute, again, the important thing to remember, and one of the things that we didn't mention a minute ago, is what bias really is. So bias is a disproportionate weight in favor or against an idea or thing. So again, anecdotal evidence, it is a bias simply because you've added disproportionate weight. You've used that as your sole purpose for making the decision. Is it wrong? No. Is it right? No, not necessarily. But understanding that you are making a decision based on a single, based on, at the end of the day, that anecdotal evidence is important. Another one that we see oftentimes, and we see this a lot in business, but in information security, is the bandwagon effect. We all know what the bandwagon effect is. Everybody else is using it. Everybody else uses this tool. It's the popular tool. I may be opening old wounds here, but I wonder how many companies 2 years ago are kicking themselves for jumping on the bandwagon related to SolarWinds. Everybody's using it. Everyone's using it. So now 18,000 companies and at least 9 government agencies who said, well, but everybody else is using it and it works just fine for them, are now mixing anecdotal evidence and the bandwagon effect and are totally blind to something that's coming. There's another really interesting bias cognitive process that occurs that's been talked about a lot recently, I feel like, which is interesting, and we'll talk about why what I just said is a little bit humorous here in a minute. But there's a bias or psychological effect known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. And if you've never heard of this before, this is the idea that when you become the Dunning-Kruger effect, and the Dunning-Kruger effect is a really interesting one. It's the I'm at the top of my career, so I know everything, and you really don't. Or conversely, I'm new to my career and I know nothing, when in fact you know a lot more than you lead on to. It's the idea that you have either an elevated or an underappreciated sense of your knowledge base. And it's a really interesting one because it plays into it and facilitates the allowing of other biases into decision making, and we'll talk about some of those here in a minute. Another one that is a really actually an interesting one, because it's one that we don't think about often, but when you really stop and think about it, it's kind of like, how could I have fallen for it, is what's known as the false consensus bias. It's the tendency to overestimate the degree to which people agree with you. Well, everybody else agrees, everybody else thinks the same way I do. So, or everybody else on my the example that I'll give is, I made a decision because I'm pretty sure everyone else on my team will agree with me. That may or may not be the case. Could it be the case? Yeah. Do you know that definitively when you're making a decision? No. Another one, and this is a big one, is the familiarity bias. Familiarity bias, think of brand recognition, think of your habit bias, or what's known as the law of the instrument, which is I've got this tool, I know how it works, I'm comfortable with it, I'm not going to use anything else because I know how this works. I know how to use this tool, and even if somebody comes along and provides a tool that does what this tool does better, I already know how to use this tool. I'm not going to spend the time. I'm not going to spend the money. I'm not going to do anything, or the one that I hear quite often, which is, well, but we've been using this tool for 20 years at this here. So why should we care about the risk? Why should we care about why should we change the tool? All our customers are familiar with this tool. I literally had this conversation yesterday with part of my business about the use of a tool that they're using, that the main argument for why they can't take a tool that has that is using FTP and move it to SFTP is because we've been using it for 20 years and that's what our customers are familiar with. So another one is, and this one's a really interesting one because, again, we don't realize the impact of it, but it's the first impression bias. We have a bias to the conclusions we make based on the first impression that we have of something. This meal's gonna, the wait to get into this restaurant was horrible. The staff, the front desk staff was not nice to me, so the meal's gonna suck. Or I had to, this doctor's appointment's gonna go horribly because I had, or this place looks really bad outside. So the food inside can't be that good. And I always like this one because I think we in Texas turn this one on its head, but I'll use this as the example. How many of you have eaten at a barbecue restaurant that when you look on the outside, you go, it can't possibly be sanitary inside? And then you go inside and eat, and it is fantastic, and you walk out going, this is the best barbecue I've ever had. Your first impression, if you gave into your first impression bias, you would look at that and go, I'm not going to eat there. But what's under, it's the judging a book by its cover mentality. Another one that is really an interesting one is frequency bias. We see something so often, we assume that is the biggest risk, or that is the biggest thing. Let's use a real example. I may be shocking a few people here, but ransomware is not the biggest risk to a company. It may be the most frequent risk, most frequent threat to a company. It is not the most damaging. By any measure, insider threat can be more damaging to a business than a ransomware incident. Theft of trade secrets can be more damaging to a business financially than a ransomware incident. But we outside, and this is the collective we of society, tend to think that ransomware is a rampant issue. And it very well may be, but that's not the biggest risk that we face oftentimes. Another one, and this is another one, and it goes back to what we've talked about before, the prospect theory and what have you, but we have what's known as loss aversion bias. We will, if we perceive, whether it's the case or not, we perceive the loss of something to be greater than the value, than what it took to gain it, we tend to apply a bias to that. And the example that I would give you with this one is when you get something, think back to when you were younger, or think back to situations where if I gave you, or another example here even that I could give you, if I gave you $100 right now, and then in 5 minutes I asked you for that $100 back, how likely are you to give me that $100 back? You've gained something with relative ease, but the loss of it now is going to affect you a lot more, or you perceive will affect you more. At the end of the day, at the end of the day, you are no worse off 5 minutes from now than you were 5 minutes ago. But the reality is you've gained something, and now you've given a value to that, a perceived value to that. And because of that, you will make decisions based on your aversion to loss. Another one, we see this quite often, and we'll talk a little bit more about this because this goes into a newer concept that exists. But there's a bias known as motivated reasoning, which is the fact that you have a bias to allowing your emotions to make decisions for you sometimes, oftentimes. And we see motivated reasoning actually working in a concept that we'll talk about here in a minute, which is called noise, which is the fact that actually more powerful than just the fact that your emotions is there are a lot of elements that affect your emotional state that actually have a greater effect on decision making. There's another one that I'll share that is near and dear to my heart because of what my wife does, but it's what's known as the Peltzman Effect, Peltzman effect. Before I explain exactly what this is, my wife is a registered nurse. I have joked for many, many, many years that the fact that my wife is a registered nurse gives me carte blanche to do stupid stuff. Because if I'm going to get hurt, when she's around, by the way, I have to caveat it. When she's around, I have that my 10-year-old son and I are allowed to do stupid stuff that might potentially get us hurt because we have her right there. The Peltzman Effect is this example by definition. The Peltzman Effect is the tendency to take greater risks when perceived safety increases. I am more likely to do something that I otherwise would not do as long as my registered nurse wife is right there. There's another one that's out there that's really interesting called the Pollyanna Principle. And the Pollyanna Principle is this. We have a bias, we have a tendency to remember positive events more than we do unpleasant events, which comes into play when you think about making risk-based decisions, especially when we talk about making perhaps a risk-based decision about which vendors we're going to work with, because we tend to find ourselves gravitating towards vendors that we've had a good experience before. And even dealing with vendors sometimes that we've had a more recent pleasant event and forgetting the fact that we had an unpleasant event with them. And the example that I would give with this is we have actually seen this play out in the aftermath of massive data breaches. How many companies, we'll even take it away from companies, but how many consumers who were affected by the Target breach still shop at Target because they've had really great experiences shopping at Target. They found what they needed. They had really pleasant events. They have a tendency to want to overlook the bad, an unpleasant event. Or who still uses SolarWinds, or who still rely primarily and only on Kronos as their payroll system. I like bringing that one up because my wife works for one of the hospitals here in Houston. I won't say which one, but Kronos happened the day before payroll for them. So, yes, exactly. Another follow the leader product. So, exactly. Another bias that we have to be aware of is is the recency bias. Everybody, we have a bias, and we see this in information security more on the negative side than we do on the positive side. But how many people for a while, right after SolarWinds or right after Corona said, "Oh yeah, you know what? We can never use these guys again," and went right back and started using them again later. After time, go back and use that same tool. Another one. We've got a couple more that I want to share, but another one is known as the self-serving bias. This is where we find the self-fulfilling prophecy falling into, or the idea that I'm only going to look for evidence, or I'm only going to look at things, I'm only going to look at elements that satisfy my particular need, that serve my benefit. And this actually finds itself in a concept known as the Semiwise Reflex, which is the tendency to reject new evidence once you've determined what your belief is, what your once you've got a paradigm in mind. Think about this is the example I like to give for this one is, this is the person who says, I hear what you're saying, but you haven't proven me wrong. So until you prove what I believe to be wrong, I'm going to stick to my belief, even in the face of new information. The last two that I want to talk about. One is one that we see, I think, quite often, that we all struggle with in our daily jobs in information security, is the sunk cost fallacy. Well, I've already spent the money on it. I've already invested a lot of time. I've already invested all this capital, this human capital in it. I've gotten my people trained up. The tool may suck, but I've already spent all this money, so we're going to continue to use it because we've already spent. Because even though the more optimal or the better solution may be to cut ties and walk away, or to make a decision that may mean that you have spent money that was, for lack of a better term, wasted, we tend to have a bias to say, I'm going to stick with the decision because I've already spent too much money trying to fix the problem, or I've already spent too much money on something else. And then the last one that I wanted, the last big one that I wanted to discuss is what's known as the von Royster effect. And that is the fact that things that stick out tend to be remembered more than things that don't. So the old example that I'll give, and it looks like I probably can go, probably in the right demographic to bring this one up, but it's the one of these things is not like the other from Sesame Street mentality. It's a lot easier, or it's it's a lot easier to identify or to focus on what's the one thing that is different about something, as opposed to all of the things that are the same about something. So how does this all play out in decision making? And understanding that I'm also keeping an eye on the time because I know there is another session coming up in about 10 minutes. I want you guys to be able to attend. But understanding all of this, there is the fact that the reason that bias plays in, and the reason that we are able to allow bias into our decision making, is because of a concept known as heuristics. And heuristics is essentially the idea that because of the limitations, because of bounded rationality and the limitations on the human brain, we have to, we do, and to some extent have to employ mental shortcuts in order to make decisions. Think about how many decisions you make in a given day. Could you truly stop and do a full-fledged risk analysis of every decision you're going to make? No, you couldn't. You would not. You would make one decision the entire day, and your decision would be, I'm not going to get out of bed. because the rest of the day is just going to be too risky for me, and I'll just stay in bed. So because of that, we apply heuristics, and heuristics plays a really important role, and understanding that we are using heuristics is what allows us to understand and to prevent unnecessary bias from being introduced into our decision making. The primary concept behind heuristics is a concept from 1956, developed by economist Herbert Simon, known as satisficing. And basically, it's as it sounds. The idea is that we as humans, the most basic, easiest shortcut we use is we set a point that we want to achieve. We set a point at which we will feel that we've made the quote unquote best decision. And once we've satisfied the criteria necessary to make that decision, we go about it. We make the decision, we move on. Do we make the most optimal decision? No, probably not. Usually not. But what we are making is the decision that satisfies our needs the most. Another aspect, another method that we use within heuristics is elimination by aspects. And the way what that is the idea that we set up a bunch of criteria for what we need. I want this meal to have, these 5 things in it. And what we do is we then go through and we literally, and when we're making a decision, or another example that I'll use is, when you go to buy a car. When you go to buy a car, you have a whole laundry list of things that you say, I want features I want in this car. You may have a list of 10 things I want to be in the car. And what you will do as you're going through the process of making that decision is you might say, okay, which one do I want? Do I want automatic or manual? Okay, well, if I want automatic, that eliminates all of these cars. If I want power windows, that eliminates these cars. And you do that, you keep eliminating options until you've gotten to the point where you've analyzed all your aspects, all of the criteria, and you're left with the decision. And then another one another kind of method that is used as well is what's known as the take the best or fast and frugal method. And this is a little different than eliminating based on criteria, because what this is the idea that we make decisions based on the first indication that I get, that if I'm given two items or 2 options, the first indication that I get that one option is going to be better than the other, doesn't matter what that option, what that indication was, I'm going to make the decision based on that and that alone. So these models, they're used. They are things that we do instinctively, and we do them because, again, we have to make our decisions. We have to make decisions quickly, and we have to make many decisions in a given day. But the challenge with it is, because we are using these shortcuts, we're allowing our mind. We as humans allow our minds to leverage criteria oftentimes that is not optimal for making the decisions. So this brings up a concept, kind of a competing there's one other element actually that we'll talk about real quickly before we jump into kind of how do we combat this. And this is a newer concept that is entered into some of the research, and that is the concept of what's known as noise. This was developed within the last 2 years, really, was identified by Daniel Kahneman and a gentleman by the name of Olivier Saboni out of France and Dr. Cass Sussman out of Chicago. And what they realized was there are actually elements of decision making that are sometimes more powerful, that are more important that are as important, if not more important, than bias to understand and be aware of when you're making a decision. And the example, the research that they did was that what they found, empirically evident in some of their research, was that judges on the bench who were given the same exact case to adjudicate, to sentence, at 10 a.m. in the morning and at 2 in the afternoon with the exact same fact set, the exact same scenario, adjudicated, applied harsher sentences at 4 o'clock in the afternoon than they did at 10 a.m. in the morning. Does anybody want to take a guess as to why that occurred? I would shorten your statement even more, actually. They were just tired. Think about your own decision making. If you had to be honest with yourself, I'm not asking anyone, I'm not going to call anyone out, but be honest with yourself. The decisions that you make at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday versus the decisions you make at 4:30 on a Friday. Probably the decision on Tuesday, you would feel a whole lot more comfortable at me asking you what the decision that you made was, and you would feel a whole lot more comfortable just defending that decision than the one that you made at 4:30 on a Friday. And yes, I used 4:30 on a Friday in the room, knowing full well what 30 minutes later means to most people in the information security world. But what that identifies is that not only the other thing that they found was not only is the time of day, but they also looked at things like hunger level. The hungrier you are, the more likely you are to make a quick snap decision and not consider the options the same way you would when you've got a full stomach. And we see that we as humans see this every day. How many of you go to the grocery store when you're hungry versus how many of you go when you're not hungry? And what is the outcome of that trip when you go hungry versus not hungry? Your decision making changes based on your hunger level. These are not biases, these are just forces of nature. They're things that exist. But they are elements, they are noise in your decision-making process that you need to be aware of. I don't have enough time, I don't really have time to get into the specifics, and we could talk totally separately about noise on its own. But I wanted to spend the last couple of minutes really running through a couple of really key things to keep in mind when you're considering the role that bias plays in your decision-making. The first, the most obvious, the reason why we're here today is to be aware of them. If you're aware of them, it is going. I've given this presentation a couple times, and invariably afterwards, people come up to me and go, "I knew I did this, but now that I'm aware that now that you've talked about it, I'm aware of it, and now I'm going to be more attentive to it." And the reality is, you are. You're going to be more attentive to it because of the fact that you're aware of it. Part of it is educating yourself about the different biases. When you start to realize again, there are 180 plus biases out there. Understanding which ones you're more prone to will give you the ability to figure out a strategy so that you can make sure that you're not to make sure that you're not employing those biases. Be curious. Embrace the opposite. Be willing and open to answer or to look at the other side, the devil's advocate or other perspective. Be open to looking for disconfirming evidence as well. The other thing, and I wish I had a little, I had a little more time to jump into this one, but there's a concept that I would encourage everyone to look at known as automated decision theory, or automated decision support, excuse me. There's some really interesting advances being made with AI to help make decisions using big data sets. With that, I know we're at our time. I appreciate everyone joining. I know we got started a little late, but I'll be around for any questions if you've got them afterwards. Thank you for joining.